Going to be talking about the education sector in Asia generally and how we would like to reimagine education coming across to us in the years to come. Now with us, we have a very strong heavyweight panel. Here on my left is Amitabh Jingan. Amitabh is the partner and lead for EY's Partners Education Center for Excellence. He advises investors, corporates, and operators in the education sector. His key focus lies in strategy, growth, and commercial diligence in the capital markets as well as in the M&A side of transactions. Of course, across from him is Raj Shastri. He's a partner at Kaizen Private Equity. Raj is a partner of Kaizen Management Advisors Private Limited. Kaizen invests in education companies that can deliver critical outcomes at scale using innovative business models, and companies that disrupt the education status quo either with new technologies or through unique technology-enabled services. Next to Raj is Neil Broker. He's the CEO for Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Asia Pacific for Laureate Education. Neil has been a director of Think Education Group Proprietary Limited since November 2017. He serves as the chief executive for Europe, Middle East, Asia, and Africa at Laureate Education since 2018. Laureate Education is a global provider of high-quality post-secondary education which encourages learning without boundaries. And right at the end there is Michael. Michael Sung. He's the CEO and managing partner of Tail Partners Group. He oversees investments in Singapore, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Michael co-founded Tail Partners in 2007, and he's been responsible for building Tail Partners and for successful investments in diverse sectors in Singapore and Malaysia. Michael is also personally very passionate about education, and is a serving member of the board of governors of his alma mater, SJI and SJI International. Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce you to the panel? No. When we talk about the education sector and we talk about the current topic at play, reimagining the education sector and investment with a learning curve, there's obviously a lot to talk about in terms of where the education sector is taking us. Key broad strokes, if I may set the context right, as we kick off the discussion. Now, it's been reported that the education sector is worth about US $370 billion. It's a US $370 billion play. The focus, as it appears, seems to center around the preference for English language learning, growing affluence, the rising middle class in our midst, in Asia, in Southeast Asia, rapid population growth in Asia generally, from China, India, Southeast Asia, the likes of Vietnam, Indonesia, and others around us. There's also an issue in affordability and scale. With such large numbers, it's become more affordable for families, smaller families, to be able to afford higher education. And that technology brings about the ability to scale the delivery of such services. And of course, what is the general impact of education technology? And mind you, this is not really a discussion about EdTech, but I have a feeling that along the way today, we're going to be talking a little bit more about education technology as we go along. And also the challenges. When you invest in the education sector, there are the usual regulatory, when it comes to FDI or licensing issues, which you'll have to face with the local authorities. And then of course, there's some places like Hong Kong, Singapore, where real estate or the acquisition of real estate for your necessary premises becomes also an issue. And also, sometimes due to the domestic circumstances, the business model limitations may also arise. So with that, I'd like to bring us straight into the discussion points. You see, when we talk about education, we're talking about education investors and operators generally. Now, the first thing I'd like to address to the panel is this very broad discussion point as we run headlong into all the other discussion issues. How are education investors and operators capitalizing on the changing demographics and rising affluence in Asia? Now, bearing in mind that the changes are different across the different geographies. It's not necessarily the same. So what may be necessarily applicable to one jurisdiction or one geography may not necessarily apply to another. So I'd like to toss this out to our panel, and if I may start the ball rolling, if I'd like Michael, if you could give us some insight into this. As you know, Michael is very passionate about education in the region. Michael.
Thank you for that. Maybe I'll share with you my personal experience, the struggle I go through. Yes, I sit on the board of St. Joseph Institution for many years, and all great schools in the world are not for profit, right? And when you say affluence means money to be made. Money to be made draws private equity investors like us in. And how do we then struggle with the fact that great schools in the world are not for profit, at the same time there are lots of money to be made in terms of education itself. And perhaps education could be one area where private equity with a conscience, right? My experiences in building schools in Vietnam, for example, is not to put the profit number in front, right? It's to say what is the end result that we can achieve, and if you can achieve the end results, the money will come. The students will flow in. The parents will queue outside the door or the gate of the school. I don't know whether I answered your question. It's to frame the discussion.
Any other members of the panel would like to add to that? Neil, yes.
Yeah. I think, the first, and this is from Laureate's experience, we really focus on education in 25 countries. And the focus, first and foremost, was on access. So if I go back 10 to 15 years in most economies, it was really about just filling a gap. The governments could not afford to keep up with the pace of education demand, and so private players stepped in. What we've seen as a massive shift in many countries is a shift from just access to quality. So the whole mantra of build and they will come no longer exists. Build and they will come if you offer something of quality. The other point that I will very much agree with is you have to do it with a conscience for sustainability. From Laureate's standpoint, we grappled with this a lot because our competition very often was not-for-profit institutions. What I'd like to share is a few years ago, we actually transitioned from being a corporation to what in the US is known as a public benefit corporation. So it's a new category of corporation structures in the US where it is for profit, but with an onus of doing good. And there are metrics that need to be measured to be able to meet that standard. So just an interesting example. We'll see how it all plays out.
Thank you, Neil. Yes, please.
Well,
Yes, right.
I think you make an interesting distinction between this whole proliferation of private education, how it is different in different geographies within Southeast Asia or Asia, for example. Earlier in the presentation we saw, with the emerging middle class, there's so much spending going on in travel, tourism, food. Well, education probably ranks below that in some countries, but in some other countries, for example in Vietnam, you see massive increase in private education. Of course, quality being one of the important factor. And the reason for that is, unfortunately, public education in most of the countries we are talking about in Asia, those are not up to the quality, and private education is taking over. So that's one. Do we see that only in the middle income segment, or there is education which is private education is also getting into low income segment? To our surprise, recently we concluded investment in the Philippines, where education has become free in the higher education segment. And in spite of that, students in the low income segment, they are going to private colleges which are charging like $1,000 per year. So this flight to quality, flight to important of student outcome, what Michael was saying, I think that's the key. If private players are delivering student outcome, which is focused on learning, which will give me a better footing in life in terms of getting me a job, then students will go for private education, and that's happening across. So in some cases, it's English language training in Vietnam, in the Philippines in higher education, in India it is preschool education, yeah, but it's happening across.
Thank you. Maybe if I could stop everyone in their tracks there. I think what I think we've gathered from the discussion so far is that student outcomes are important. If student outcomes are important, that means we're also talking about the quality of the education package that we're delivering to the masses will also become very, very important. Is that entirely an issue that's got to deal with bringing the right global brands into the market? Are we talking about the fact that some investors and education service providers can actually provide a more dynamic business model that can be deployed to take advantage of the different domestic landscapes? And I'd like to start to kick this discussion off from Amitabh.
Yeah, thanks, Ashwin. I mean, just going back to your first question as well. I mean, I think the education opportunity actually is different for operators and different for investors. I think what operators need to do is, obviously, I think as Neil and Raj and Michael said, they need to fill a gap in provision, which means access. So there's a large number of sort of the demographic that does not have access to high quality education. So that's one part of what they do. And then the second is they need to, obviously look at models that provide better outcomes, better provision, around, focused on specific needs. I think investors obviously would look to back successful operators who have obviously demonstrated a track record of establishing quality and obviously and of course have the ability to demonstrate scale beyond what they're doing currently. I think to answer your sort of question around brands and international brands, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that most forms or most of education or pretty much all of education is actually a very regional product, if I were to use that word. So schools, universities, even preschools are bounded sort of in some ways by geography. So, a preschool is sort of famous in a neighborhood, may not be famous or may not be known in other parts of the city. Schools, again, tend to be more catchment driven. Universities have a much broader, I would say geographic footprint, but again are constrained by regulation. Because there are obviously rules around recognition, accreditation, and affiliation that universities and university providers need to keep in mind. So I think just on a standalone basis, global brands may not be the game changer. They obviously, however, we've seen the emergence of global platforms. Folks like Laureate, you've got a whole bunch of large global K-12 platforms who've achieved great success over the years. And I think the key element that they bring to the table is really the intellectual property, the standards and the processes that are needed to deliver the quality, to deliver the outcomes that students and parents need, as opposed to just the brand. So the brand's important, but I think it's equally important to be able to very clearly identify what it is that brand would actually deliver in the context of the local market before being able to form a conclusion as to whether or not that's a successful strategy or a successful opportunity.
Thank you, Amitabh.
Yeah, maybe I can chime in here. There are a lot of private schools in Vietnam, for example, developed by property developers. They build a school and they build the housing estate around the school. Main driving force is that they want to sell the property, not to run the school itself. And we see a lot of examples of property developers mismanaging the schools and spoiling the future for kids. And this is very, very sad, right? The kids have only one chance at education and they spoil it. So in that sense itself, the global brand, I agree with you, brings in discipline, brings in methodology, brings in skill set, right? And more importantly, have a common and coherent vision to run the school itself that can then be transposed or can be translated into the individual schools itself.
Thanks, Michael. Gentlemen? Yes,
Yeah.
Neil?
education it's an aspiration, right? It's an aspiration, especially in this part of the world where many families, our university in China, 70% of the students who came to that university were the first in their family to ever go to university. So there is a lot of pride associated with it. And so global brands clearly fit into that aspiration. But the reality is global brands cater to the top 3 to 5% of the student body. Beyond that, it's about the outcome. Right? So the aura of a global brand fades very quickly if that brand is not delivering on the outcome. Because for most people, it's, there's health, there's food, and education. And after that, everything is discretionary. It's a luxury spend for many families in this part of the world. And so if they're not getting the value that they expect, they're out.
Thanks. Yes, Raj.
As an investor, this sector always excited me and excites me every day, is because, unlike some of these consumer services and goods where global brand can eat the local brand, right, and very difficult for a local brand to compete, in education is just the opposite. Local brands actually thrive. The problem is whether local brand can scale, right? And the reason being, it's a local branding business, education at the end of the day. And so that's number one. Number two is, because of that, I think there is a greater achievement in the sector which is happening. Global brand, they face competition from local brands. That actually helps in improving the quality of all the players in this segment, right? And this we have seen in every segment of education, right? So I think, to me, brand can be created once a consistent quality student outcome is being delivered, right? And when we come in as a private equity player, probably we'll come to that point later, how do we help companies to scale, right, when they have created a local brand?
Thank you, Raj. And this brings us to a very important point about the education sector. I mean, we all talk about education being for the student outcome. And sometimes there's this belief that when you deploy certain, or when you facilitate the ability to scale, you will end up referring to the use of technology. Now, the numbers in Asia, from the population growth to the growth in income levels, are huge. They are expected to grow exponentially over the next decade. How big is the opportunity in Asia, and how does one navigate this vertical? And I think the question really is technology the answer to scale? So how big a role does technology play in disrupting the education landscape? Because believing that you're talking about student outcomes, I think there's also, this very open view that when you have a very mass approach to education, where education may be deployed through technology, where everything is almost virtual, where there may not be the kind of person-to-person coaching which presently takes place, although on a slightly different scale in many schools, if you like, when you have one teacher and you talk about student-to-teacher ratio and so on. How big is a role for technology to play in the education landscape? Please. Thanks, Amitabh.
So I think technology, especially in emerging markets, such as Southeast Asia, China, the likes of them, has just a huge role to play in creating growth, creating scale. I think it's important, however, to understand that it does not replace some of the more conventional forms of education, but coexists and supplements. I mean, in most education categories that you would find, whether schools, universities, tutoring, test prep, preschools, your adoption levels are no more than 25, 30, 35% of the population, right? If there's 100 people who theoretically can access or, can afford or can access or need to access a certain form of education, no more than 25 to 30% of that population or that cohort actually accesses it. So I think what technology is doing is just opening up the market to a much larger cross-section of people. By doing two things: one, providing much easier access, and second, obviously lowering the cost of accessing that education. Interestingly, it's not changing things, right? You talked about tutoring. The largest segment within online education in China today, or even the US for that matter, is one-on-one tutoring. So the only difference is you've now got a teacher who's sitting in a different part of the world, a different city, on the other side of a computer, teaching to a class of 40, 50, 60 students. So the only difference is the medium, everything else remains the same. It also has demonstrated a very clear ability to personalize the learning. So if a student is not kind of understanding a concept, there are ways to sort of personalize that journey for the student through remediation, through testing, etc. And it also has the ability to also enable collaboration at a much larger scale. So at least I believe it's going to have a very, very profound impact on education as a sector. It's not going to replace, but it is going to supplement, it is going to add to what's sort of happened. And I think there is, especially this part of the world, will actually demonstrate the benefit in some ways of being the last mover, where, in some of these things, if you are the last mover, you actually, achieve a competitive advantage. So I think there is going to be a significant, expansion in technology-based provision over the next, 7 to 10 years in this region.
Thanks, Amit. Sorry, Neil, I saw you taking the mic. Neil.
I think in some ways, and we all get very passionate about the impact of technology and ed tech, etc. But I think education is no different than any other industry. And I think just the lives that we lead, technology is and will continue to disrupt everything that we do. And education will be no exception. I think technology gets a disproportionate share of the media bites and investment dollars. Today, everybody gets very excited about EdTech. EdTech transactions are on the front page of the newspaper. And frankly, folks like us who sometimes operate, brick and mortar institutions, are kind of viewed as dinosaurs almost. The reality, though, today is that, higher education globally it's a $1 trillion industry, if you can call it that. Technology-based delivery of higher education is less than 1% of that revenue pool. So I think the impact of technology will keep growing, but as Amitabh said, it's not going to happen overnight, number one. And I think the end state is going to be one where there is tremendous convergence between technology-based players and traditional brands or distribution channels, which would be the traditional universities, colleges, etc. And what we're seeing increasingly, and at a much more rapid pace, month over month, is the pace of that convergence, with traditional education businesses acquiring technology-based businesses. Technology-based businesses increasingly partnering with traditional businesses because they realize that is their only path to scale. So I think, and our thesis is one of convergence, not of either or.
Thanks, Neil.
Can I just add to that?
Yes, Michael.
I think education implies values. Like what we are teaching the students are values rather than the content or knowledge itself. Unfortunately, for many of the developing countries itself, they do not have enough teachers to be able to teach English, for example. We run a software program teaching Vietnamese schools English, right? There's far not enough English teachers in Vietnam, right? Unfortunately, the expat teachers are super expensive. You cannot bring an expat teacher to teach, right? So inevitably, technology is the shortcut to teaching them English, but it's not the end goal. The end goal is to be able then to help them to gain their values that is required in education.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, Mark.
Yes, one point I want to make is, somehow, many of us think that, technology is the answer to scalability. But I want to make this point that the answer to scalability is the strategy you want to take and also the team you want to build. And technology is one element of that. And technology can be used in learning, in non-learning, both aspects, like in every company, right? Over a period of time, we have done experiments with our portfolio companies, and I'll share one. This is in a heavy teacher-intensive test prep business model, where teachers are expected to teach students for 4 or 5 hours every day, after school. And when we introduce blended learning, where students are going to go back and read from the tablet, do assessment on it, and reduce the teaching hour in the classroom. We did a survey for students who were exposed to that environment compared to students who were following the traditional path. And it was not from a scalability. We thought from a product delivery standpoint that whether that was a better outcome. Did the students get the better outcome or not by taking a test? And that students actually loved the second method more because it was truly engaging for them. Right? So I think when we talk about technology, rather than thinking from a scalability standpoint that, well, there are no teachers involved, I can scale, I don't have to handle it. I think we have to think from a student outcome standpoint or student experience standpoint, whether it is delivering a better result, is it a better product?
So it would seem that human interaction is still extremely important in trying to derive the correct student outcomes. That seems to be the consensus that we have here. Now, we have about another 6 to 7 minutes to go before we open this to the floor. Now, I'd like to compress some of these issues I have on my list here to 1 or 2 points. That we were talking about, we've always been talking about the delivery, the outcomes that we want. Let's take a step back and let's look at what investors may be looking for. What today, what drives deal flow into the education sector in Asia? Are we looking at just the ability to scale because that will bring in you the numbers? But I think I take what you all said just now because it's actually driven by the desire to have the right student outcomes. Scale is just one aspect of the delivery system. What are your thoughts about the less usual drivers that you might have come across? So one key thing about this is that while we talk about technology, it suddenly, it's surfaced right now that student outcomes are important. Are there other drivers that you might have come across which are a little different from what you have encountered before in the past when it comes to the education sector? Could you share that with us, please?
Right. So are you talking about investment, what drives the investment?
Yes. From the investment standpoint, yes.
Right. Well, from the investment standpoint, I believe, like every other sector, I think investors will only generate shareholder value, or the company will generate shareholder value once it generates value for its customers, right? So both converge in the long term, both converges. So having said that, I think if we are looking at different subsectors of education, in some sectors such as early childhood sector, I think it's more service driven. Their quality of service is important. If we are looking for something which is taking a GMAT or a TOEFL, then it's very dependent on the scores. So depending on which particular sector I'm targeting, those actually drive. Sometimes it's driven by jobs, sometimes it's driven by scores, driven by service levels. So yeah, so when we look at different subsectors, we take that into account while making the investments.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, if I may, and just kind of put the boring elephant on the table, I think in this part of the world, it's scale. I think scale has frustrated, or the lack of scale has frustrated investors in education globally, but particularly in Asia. Again, when I look around the room and, we are in some ways an investor ourselves, but I look at, private equity investors, etc. This is, I think, the biggest frustration, which is there is a big mismatch between the perceived size of the opportunity, demographics, etc., and the prevalence of assets of scale and assets of quality that have been unable to scale. And so again, I think just to call a spade in ASEAN, 600 million plus people, as we saw from Tom's presentation earlier, $2.5 trillion economy, there are probably no more than 3 or 4 education businesses with 100 million plus in revenues, US. And I think that's an issue. Now, to Raj's point, I think the key to overcoming that as an investor and as an operator is number one, to take the long view. Okay, because education does take some time. So I think taking the long view and management, building management capability, and that conviction, again, it's a circle, because that conviction will come from a belief that there is scale. If you believe that you can scale, you will attract a quality management team, and it feeds into each other. But I think scale is the fundamental issue here.
Thank you.
Can I
Yes.
add in? There are 3 outcomes that you want to achieve. One, of course, the guy become a decent person. Secondly, that he becomes a good citizen. But more importantly for the individual and the family is that he's able then to earn a living. Right? And here is, I think the opportunity is that there is entire value chain that you curate, in the sense that not to give him just an education itself, but to be thereafter what happens, right? A good case in point is that we have invested in 2 nursing schools. Our nurses comes out, they work in a government hospital or the clinic, they get $100 a day. Which is decent in Vietnam itself. But we then tell them, okay, after you have come out with a nursing qualification, we teach you Japanese. And where do they end up? In Japan, they earn $2,000. That is very scalable, and it makes a material difference. So in a sense, private equity can come in to see the full dynamics of where they can end up to earn a decent living, and obviously we will capitalize on that.
And I think, I mean, just to add, sorry, I think it's still early days in the cycle for education investing, right? I mean, I think a lot of assets in the region have only just about seen their first phase of institutional ownership. So, clearly some of these. So scale is obviously the big challenge. But I think the 2 other points that, I'd just add, which are related to that, is really, finding sort of the right management teams, which then, in turn have the ability to drive a much more aggressive, a much more ambitious, growth trajectory. A lot of it which would be sort of more the classical buy and build, education story, which is, you buy an asset, you then, ramp it up, grow it out. I think that whole strategy will need these 2 elements to play. But capital is obviously a great, has a great role to play in all of that. So still early in the sort of, in the overall curve, investing life cycle, but in addition to scale, I think a strong management team and a desire to grow beyond your home country would be important, because there are some common themes across the region that we see.
Thank you, Amitabh. Now, as you've heard, it's still early days for education. You've heard about the elephant in the room that's rampaging through this hall. It's called scale. We have to deal with it. And again, we're back to right where we started. At the end of the day, education is still about the slew of the supply chain activities, the entire value chain from the right service providers right down to the technology assets, right down to the company, the client. Sorry, not the company. The ultimate beneficiaries of this this entire journey. Now, I I've been told I just have 5 minutes, and I'd like to take this opportunity to open this discussion to the floor so that we can have our panelists respond to some of your queries. Questions, please. Yes.
My question is addressed to all of the panelists. We've actually reviewed a number of investments in education companies, and one of the challenges has actually been the dearth of capable management team. Amitabh, you mentioned the buy and build strategies. We've actually found very few situations where management teams are equipped to do that, at least on a 3 to 5 year kind of time horizon. How do each of you think about this potential bottleneck for this sector?
Well, I can tell from my experience. So we looked at different. So there are 2 points I want to make. One is education first. Initially, when we started, a lot of top management, they didn't view education as a viable sector to get employed to. And here I'm talking about an ex-colleague of Neil, who came from a different industry. And when he heard that Laureate, who's Laureate, right? And Laureate is today one of the largest and more coveted organizations to work for, right? So I think it is our responsibility as an investor also in the sector, to attract management talent from other sectors, and other sectors being consumer services, because there is a huge overlap in every aspects of the business, be it operation, handling human resources, marketing, sales. So that's one aspect. The other thing is more and more people mature. M&A, as long as it is not to just create this investor thing of just to create a platform, it's really to acquire a company for geographical expansion, for a new product line. I think it's possible. I take your point that 5 years probably is too short to create this huge platform, but if a company is large enough and they are looking to acquire small centers or campuses across the country, it is possible, and we have done that in our portfolio.
Can I just add to that? What we have done, not to recruit the 30, 40-something-year-old managers, is we go out and recruit people who have retired in the education industry in UK, in Australia, in New Zealand. This will be the 50, 60 people who are looking for a new purpose in life. They retired, they're not after money because their kids are all very big. They would love to have a 2 or 3 years experience in Asia. And Asia is a very nice place to settle down, hot sun, not the cold weather in London. And we attract a lot of people there, right, who's prepared to come in for a reasonable salary, but not going to make big bucks, but they are decent, they know what it takes to make a good education system works.
Yeah, I mean, if I may just share from our experience, because in some ways we've been in the region for 11 years. And while we're part of a global organization, our strategy really was essentially a buy and build. Just our experience, management has been our number one constraint. So I think your point is very valid. It is a number one constraint. Over 11 years, I have seen us go through 2 to 3 management teams in each of our markets or at the region, however you cut it. So, there is no perfect science, and we do this for a living. We're in the education business, but finding the right talent is difficult because you need to find somebody who is highly commercial for a buy and build strategy, but at the same token understands and appreciates the fact that there is a social mission, and that your key stakeholder are students and academicians, right, who have slightly different priorities and an approach to life. And I will also tell you that even after you go through that whole journey, for instance, we worked with one of the top global recruiting firms to figure out kind of a methodology to attract the right manager. Who is the right manager for education? And we put our recruits through that process. Even after going through that process, our success rate was 50%. So it is a challenge. But again, I think as the sector matures in this part of the world, that pool of talent will hopefully increase.
And I mean, just all great thoughts. I mean, I think just two quick responses to what you said. I mean, I think given where you're coming from, which is, you want to make an investment in a business, I think two things. One, I think you will have to invest a lot more time understanding businesses and ensuring that there is, you're comfortable with the management team, one. And second, you should, if you do find opportunities where you, come across a strong team, you should seriously think about backing that with obviously all the, the other safeguards in place from your, to align with your investment philosophy. But I think if you get a strong team, you should definitely look to back it. I think there's enough examples world over of education businesses that have done exceptionally well because they had a very solid, very experienced and motivated and of course aligned management team. So I think to me that's just two small sort of just suggestions.
Thank you, Amitabh. With that, unfortunately, we've run out of time. So without going into a lot of conclusions, I'm going to suggest that we do this later when we break for lunch. Please do come up to meet our panelists if you've got any specific questions for them or any one of us.